Marisol Reyes pedaled through the whispering dawn mist, her breath rising in soft clouds as she navigated the narrow lane that led to Rosewood Community Garden. The sky was an uncertain gray, streaked with the first pale hints of morning light, and the plants along the roadside bowed under the weight of sleepy dew. In her basket rode a brass watering can, its surface gleaming faintly, and her worn leather satchel held gloves, a small trowel, and the last of the heirloom tomato seedlings she had nurtured since early spring. She had greeted each seed like a new friend, tending them with care and coaxing their fragile shoots toward the sun. Today, she planned to stake the tallest blossoms and prune the basil patch she'd coaxed into a bushy abundance. When Marisol reached the garden's perimeter, her heart fluttered with anticipation. In warmer months, she had spent hours here, kneeling between neat beds of kale and carrots, swapping harvest tips with fellow growers, and laughing over world events with neighbors who shared her love of fresh soil and homegrown produce. The iron gate, however, stood closed, its familiar creak replaced by a solid thud against the frame. The lock, once weathered and pliant, now glinted with a new, unforgiving sheen. She dismounted and rubbed at her palms, unused to the sudden chill of exclusion. A yellowed notice, stapled atop the cold metal, fluttered in the breeze. Its bold type announced that her plot had been reclaimed for unauthorized amendments, and that her rights as a gardener were forthwith revoked. Marisol's fingers trembled as she reached out, half expecting the paper to dissolve beneath her touch, but it stayed stubbornly in place. She read the words twice, her pulse pounding in her ears, the soil she had enriched, the seeds she had watered, the tender sprouts she had sheltered through late frosts, all declared violations of the board's rigid rules. She pressed her glove to her heart, feeling the ache of betrayal radiate through her chest. Behind her, the garden waited in silent indignation. Beyond the gate lay rows of plants tilting toward an unseen sun, a symphony of green hushed by the abrupt boundary. The wrought iron fence, which had once been a gentle threshold welcoming hands eager to nurture, now loomed like a sentry guarding a fortress. Marisol traced the latticework with her gaze, memorizing every curving vine and paint-flaked post, as though committing to memory the lines of an old friend she would soon lose. As the morning light strengthened, Marisol felt the familiar rhythm of the earth beneath her fingernails stir a quiet resolve. She stepped back from the gate and surveyed the surrounding block. Quiet townhouses draped in wisteria, the bakery 2 streets over readying its ovens, the church steeple's bell just beginning to toll. A world continued beyond this locked sanctuary, one full of corners yet to be reclaimed. Gathering her tools, she squared her shoulders and breathed in the cool air, the scent of damp earth mingling with distant brewing coffee. If this garden would no longer have her, then she would find another patch of soil to awaken. For in every handful of earth lay the potential for new beginnings, and Marisol's hands itched with the promise of tomorrow's harvest. Marisol stood in the abandoned lot as the sun climbed higher, its rays slicing through a canopy of blackberry, brambles and ragged weeds. The ground beneath her feet was a patchwork of cracked asphalt, half-buried stones, and stubborn clumps of dandelions that had claimed the terrain in her absence. She knelt and scraped the surface with her grandmother's trowel, each scrape revealing dark, loamy soil hidden beneath years of neglect. The air smelled of earth and possibility, and as she worked, she could almost feel the ghosts of previous gardens urging her on. By midday, she had cleared a small rectangle of ground and dragged out 2 wooden pallets she'd scavenged from a nearby construction site. With the help of a retired schoolteacher she'd recruited, her hair a halo of silver curls and her hands steady with years of practice, they filled the pallets with the rich soil she'd brought from home. The teacher's laughter rang like bells as she told Marisol stories of victory gardens during the war, of neighbors trading zucchini for lanterns and kindness blossoming in the darkest times. Their stories wove through the air as they patted soil into place, creating raised beds that promised deep roots and generous yields. A single father who lived down the street arrived with his young daughter holding a battered watering can. He wore paint-spattered jeans and a kind, tired smile. The girl, eyes wide with curiosity, followed Marisol's instructions to gently press seeds into the soil in neat rows. Together they planted kale seedlings, crimson and emerald leaves standing proud against the dark earth, pepper starts that trembled in the breeze, and bean seeds that promised winding tendrils in a few short weeks. At each bed's edge, Marisol tied small hand-painted markers: kale, sweet peppers, bush beans, the letters looping with her careful hand. As afternoon shadows lengthened, a group of local teenagers, summoned by word of mouth and the promise of community service hours, arrived armed with gloves and rakes. Under Marisol's guidance, they wrestled stubborn weeds from between the beds, their synchronized hacks echoing like a drumbeat of collective effort. One boy paused to ask why they were doing this in a place nobody wanted. Marisol smiled and explained how nourishment was a right, not a privilege, and how every person deserved a share of the harvest, no matter where they lived or how they arrived at that gate this morning. The boy nodded gravely, as though the weight of her words settled deep in him, and returned to his weeding with renewed focus. By the time the golden light of late afternoon poured through the blackberry thorns, the lot had transformed. Neat raised beds rose from the asphalt, each one a verdant promise against the gray backdrop of the city. Marigolds dotted the corners, their bright petals a guard against pests and a beacon of hope. A small makeshift pavilion of reclaimed wood and a colorful tarp offered a shady gathering place where Marisol and her volunteers could rest. They filled water cans from jugs and sipped cold lemonade, sharing quiet moments of camaraderie. Marisol looked at the new garden with a swelling pride. She traced a finger along a leaf of basil that had sprung up alongside the kale, an unintended volunteer, perhaps, but now part of the family she and her neighbors had created. In the distance, honking cars and the hum of daily life continued unabated, but here, in this reclaimed corner, a different rhythm pulsed. The soft rustle of leaves, the steady drip of watering cans, and the collective heartbeat of a community, united. As dusk settled and the first stars peeked through, Marisol closed her eyes and breathed in the scent of damp soil and growing things. Though Rosewood had locked her out, she had found a new home for her dreams, and tomorrow, when the harvest began, she would share it with every hungry heart in the city. By the third morning, Marisol's makeshift garden had become a locus of purpose that radiated through the neighborhood. She arrived before sunrise, her boots crunching on the gravel path she and her volunteers had cleared, and found a small crew already at work beneath the pale glow of dawn. At the far edge of the lot, a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Henderson knelt beside a raised bed, her silver curls illuminated like a halo as she gently pruned a cluster of pepper plants that had taken to the soil with surprising vigor. Across from her, a single father, Jamal, helped his 8-year-old daughter, Layla, carefully space tomato seedlings in a neat grid. Their cheeks were rosy with the chill morning air, and Layla's small hands worked with determined concentration, her tongue peeking between her lips in comic seriousness. Marisol paused to thank Mrs. Henderson for staying late the night before to reinforce the pallet beds against slumping. The teacher straightened, brushing a stray lock of hair from her forehead, and recounted stories of her own mother tending a victory garden during wartime rationing. She spoke of how neighbors traded zucchinis for canned peaches, how the act of sharing food, itself a radical kindness, had knit entire communities together. Marisol listened, enthralled by the cadence of the old gardener's voice, and then turned to invite another neighbor to join them. At the center of the lot, a group of teenagers, some summoned by a school service learning program, others drawn by word of mouth, were filling wheelbarrows with rich compost donated from a local stable. They laughed as they jockeyed for position, the wheelbarrow's single wheel veering off course and sending one boy into a surprised tumble. Soon they were all scooping soil with long-handled shovels, the dark earth falling in soft mounds beside each planting row. Marisol gathered them around the young oak sapling she had discovered in a nearby park, its roots coiled in a tangle of rebel determination. She encouraged them to treat it gently, to remember that every tree, like every person, needed care to stand tall. One of the boys, wearing a Letterman jacket, asked why they were pouring so much effort into a patch of land that had been written off as worthless. Marisol met his gaze, her own eyes bright, and replied that worth was found not in neat bylaws or tidy fences, but in the shared labor of forgiveness and growth. She spoke of the locked gate at Rosewood, the very symbol of exclusion, and of how their work here was a living protest, a testament that nourishment and community belonged to everyone. Moved by her words, the teens straightened with renewed vigor, planting rainbow chard whose leaves shimmered purple and gold, arranging bundles of bean vines along handmade bamboo trellises. Layla skipped between their rows, collecting fallen seeds in a small jar, her laughter a bright counterpoint to the choreographed thumps of shovels and trowels. Midday arrived with the hum of cicadas and the warmth of the sun pressing through a bruised sky. Volunteers paused under the shade of a makeshift pavilion, an old tarp stretched over scavenged poles, to sip cool water and exchange stories. Mrs. Henderson produced a thermos of sweet tea and passed cups around, while Jamal shared his vision of a summer potluck held right here, among the raised beds, where every dish would feature at least one ingredient from their garden. As the hours passed, Marisol stepped back and surveyed the scene. A kaleidoscope of hands digging, planting, pruning, and tending. An improvised community born of necessity and nurtured by empathy. The garden, once a forlorn lot, now pulsed with possibility. Rows of leafy greens rustling in the breeze, peppers gleaming like embers, bean vines unfurling in graceful spirals. In that moment, she understood that this was more than a rebellion against exclusion. It was the living proof that when strangers accept each other's hands in the soil, they cultivate not just plants, but the truest roots of community. Under a sky where the moon hung low and silvered the city in gentle light, Marisol and her core team assembled at the edge of the clandestine garden. The hush of night draped itself across the abandoned lot, broken only by the distant hum of freeway traffic and the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. Marisol carried 2 sturdy wooden crates, their interiors lined with clean burlap, ready to become vessels for the season's first true bounty. She motioned to Mrs. Henderson, who approached with a wicker basket cradling plump heirloom tomatoes, deep crimsons and sun-kissed golds that glowed beneath the moonlight. Jamal guided his daughter, Layla, forward. The little girl's eyes shone with excitement as she held a smaller crate, determined to carry her share. A circle of teenagers gathered behind them, flashlights pulsing like friendly fireflies, each student ready with gloves, clippers, and extra crates strapped to hand carts. Marisol led the way into the heart of the garden, where rows of peppers hung heavy on their vines, and beans cascaded down trellises in green torrents. The volunteers worked swiftly but carefully, stems clipped with precision, roots lifted gently to preserve delicate fruit, and each harvest placed reverently into the awaiting containers. The authors of this midnight harvest moved like choreographed dancers, voices low and reverent, the air filled with the susurrus of leaves and the soft thud of produce meeting wood. By the time the first crate brimmed with vegetables, tomatoes, peppers, green beans, and kale leaves shimmering with dewdrops, Marisol signaled that it was time to distribute. They wheeled out the crates along the makeshift path that led to the city's poorer blocks, where streetlights cast pools of amber and shadows danced against storefronts long closed. Their first stop was the back entrance of Harmony Women's Shelter, where a night shift nurse, bleary-eyed and grateful, received the produce with quivering hands. A single hushed thank you carried more weight than 100 polite nods. Next, Marisol led them down a narrow alley beside the community clinic. There, under the flickering glow of a faulty lamp, they placed bundles of kale and green beans on the step, accompanied by a small handwritten note. From your neighbors, with care. They moved on to a late-night soup kitchen, loading crates onto service carts where exhausted volunteers marveled at the freshness of the harvest, promising to turn it into nourishing meals by dawn. Their final destination was the senior center around the corner, a modest brick building whose windows glowed faintly against the night. Marisol knocked gently and waited, the crate heavy in her arms. An elderly volunteer opened the door, leaning on her walker, and broke into a broad smile when she saw the bounty. The group helped carry produce inside, lining tables with a rainbow of vegetables that would brighten breakfast tables and hearts alike. As Marisol and her companions slipped back toward the hidden garden, their steps light with purpose, the city seemed to exhale around them. By the time the moon dipped toward the horizon, the crates were empty, but the spirit of the night remained full, of shared hope, quiet defiance, and the knowledge that a single midnight's labor could feed not just bodies, but belief in community itself. Returning to the garden, they knelt once more among the beds, pressing the earth lightly around newly forming seedlings, and whispered thanks to the soil that had nourished both plant and purpose. In that sacred hour, beneath the words "unauthorized amendments" still fluttering on the rosewood gate in Marisol's mind, a new truth had blossomed. Kindness, like water, finds every crack and makes the world bloom. As dawn broke over the city, the vibrant energy of Marisol's midnight harvest still hummed in the air, but so did the rumble of discontent. By mid-morning, Marisol began receiving urgent calls and messages. Photographs of Rosewood Community Gardens board members gathered atop the old tool shed, their faces stern with indignation. They'd plastered new notices along the fence. Unauthorized activity prohibited, harvest distributions deemed trespassing, and threatened trespass fines up to $500. Word filtered in that the association's council had prepared cease and desist letters demanding Marisol and every volunteer immediately cease and refrain from harvesting or distributing produce under threat of legal action. Marisol felt a cold knot tighten in her chest, but she refused to let fear take root. She rallied her core team beneath the loose canopy of blackberry brambles. Mrs. Henderson, the retired schoolteacher, adjusted her shawl and offered a steadying presence. Jamal wiped his daughter's dirt-smudged cheek and nodded, determination shining in his eyes. The teenagers fell silent, their hands clenched around gardening gloves, ready to defend their new sanctuary. Together, they formulated a plan of peaceful resistance peppered with compassion. First, they would continue their nightly distributions, but with increased caution, using varied routes and rotating teams to avoid direct confrontations. Next, they drafted an open letter addressed to the Rosewood Board and the wider community. Signed by over 100 neighbors, single parents, seniors, local entrepreneurs, and the youths who'd found purpose in the garden, the letter appealed to shared values: the right to nourishment, the importance of community solidarity, and the healing power of fresh food. They delivered printed copies to each board member's door, accompanied by bouquets of basil and parsley as tokens of continued goodwill. Meanwhile, volunteers organized a daytime open garden gathering on the vacant lot, inviting journalists and local activists to witness the fruits of their labor. As cameras rolled and reporters scribbled notes, Marisol led attendees through the rows of thriving kale and beans, recounting the board's exclusionary edict and contrasting it with the garden's real purpose: to feed and unite. Families shared stories of how the midnight produce had sustained them. An elderly couple spoke of soup warmed by stolen tomatoes. A single mother described her child's first taste of fresh peas, and a formerly homeless veteran testified that the garden's bounty had reminded him of home. The public outcry was immediate and overwhelming. Letters of protest flooded the association's mailbox. Social media campaigns tagged board members in pleas to reverse the ban. Neighborhood meetings swelled beyond capacity. Even some board members began to question their stance, admitting privately that the policy of exclusion had backfired, painting the garden and themselves as heartless gatekeepers rather than stewards of community welfare. By week's end, as Marisol and her volunteers prepared another clandestine evening harvest, they heard the hum of conversation near the locked gate. Hope trembled in her chest as she and Mrs. Henderson crept forward to find the board's president, penitent and unguarded, holding out a freshly printed key. "We were wrong," she said quietly, voice thick with regret. "Rosewood's gates are open again, for everyone who wants to grow, share, and belong." Relief and triumph washed over Marisol as she accepted the key. Under the watchful moon, she and her team turned it together, the lock clicking open like a declaration of return. Beyond the gate, the orderly beds of the original garden stood ready to welcome them home, proof that even the harshest backlash could not uproot a community determined to bloom. The morning after the largest daytime gathering, Marisol awoke to a chorus of notifications buzzing on her phone. Headlines from the local paper praising the garden that would not be denied, live stream invitations from neighborhood watch groups, and a flood of messages from families thanking her for restoring access. She dressed quickly and pedaled to Rosewood Community Garden, eager to see if the board's contrition extended beyond words. As she arrived, she found the gate ajar, sunlight spilling across paths that only hours before had been barred. Beyond the entrance, volunteers, some familiar faces from the midnight crew, others new, tended to long-neglected plots. A handful of curious board members hovered near the tool shed, exchanging shy smiles with the very gardeners they had once banished. Marisol paused at the threshold, inhaling the mingled scents of damp earth and basil, and stepped forward to convene the day's first meeting. In the center of the garden, beneath a robust quince tree, Marisol and the board's president, Ms. Carroll, whose once stern posture now bore the weight of humility, unfurled a large parchment scroll. On it were the revised bylaws, automatic reinstatement of any gardener previously removed for unauthorized amendments, a new committee seat reserved for a volunteer representative, and a formal agreement to allocate a portion of plot fees toward subsidized beds for low-income families. As Ms. Carroll read each amendment aloud, relief and applause swept through the assembled volunteers and returning gardeners like a warm breeze. Marisol's heart swelled. Policy on paper had finally caught up to the garden's living mission. Following the ratification of the new bylaws, the group dispersed into productive clusters. In one plot, retired teacher Mrs. Henderson and a pair of returning board members laid out irrigation lines funded by a small city grant secured after the public outcry. Nearby, Jamal oversaw the construction of sturdy benches carved from reclaimed wood, delegates from the local carpenters' union donating both materials and labor. Layla and a troop of neighborhood children planted sunflowers along the pathway, their tall stalks forming a golden corridor that would guide visitors deeper into the garden's embrace. Journalists lingered at the edge of the beds, capturing footage of the transformation. A local radio host conducted interviews under the quince tree, asking Marisol how it felt to see former adversaries become collaborators. Her answer was simple and genuine. "This garden belongs to all of us. When we open our gates and our hearts, we all grow stronger." That afternoon, a block party unfolded beneath the shade of the garden's elder grapevine arbors. Long tables groaned under dishes crafted from the morning's harvest, kale quiche bites, pepper-stuffed pastries, and crisp bean salads. Neighbors who had once avoided the garden's locked gate now mingled with veterans of the midnight distributions, sharing plates and laughter as the grapevines dripped their first clusters of sweet fruit. A local folk band strummed gentle melodies, and children danced between trellised tomatoes, their giggles chasing away any lingering bitterness. As dusk settled, Marisol stood on a small rise overlooking the beds, now brimming with new seedlings and the promise of future harvests. The quince tree's blossoms glowed in the lantern light, and the benches bore the marks of countless hands already etching memories into their grain. She reflected on the journey from exclusion to inclusion, from the locked gate that had once crushed her spirit to this open sanctuary nourished by hundreds of hearts. In that luminous moment, Marisol understood that real change took root not in bylaws alone, but in the shared labor of many hands, the willingness to listen, and the courage to turn a wound into a wellspring of community vitality. The morning sun filtered through the arching boughs of the quince tree as Rosewood Community Garden buzzed with a sense of normalcy laced with triumph. Marisol arrived before dawn, her boots crunching on the gravel path now lined with sunflowers, each a living testament to the community's shared labor. She paused at the gate, where the brass key hung for all to use, and watched neighbors file in, young parents pushing strollers, teens with sketchbooks, retirees bearing baskets of hand tools. At the center of the garden, beneath a newly erected pergola draped in grapevines, volunteers assembled long folding tables. Today was Seed Day, the final step in Marisol's vision, sharing every last heirloom variety with the wider city. Alongside social service providers setting up information booths, local chefs arrived to demonstrate how to transform the garden's bounty into meals that could nourish bodies and lift spirits. A volunteer from the city's health department unloaded crates of reusable seed packets, marked Tomato Cherokee Purple, Pepper Bolivian Rainbow, Bean, Dragon Tongue, ready for distribution. Marisol climbed onto a low stone wall and tapped her trowel against the wooden pergola support. A hush fell as she spoke. This garden began as a reaction to exclusion, but today it becomes a catalyst for inclusion, one seed at a time. She described how every packet represented not just a plant, but hope for families who once could afford only store-bought produce for children who'd never tasted a tomato picked at peak ripeness, and for seniors seeking purpose in their golden years. As the first seed packets were handed out, Marisol moved through the crowd, helping little hands fill envelopes and showing parents how to plant depth and spacing. The chefs, one preparing a simple tomato and basil bruschetta, another crafting a spicy bean stew, offered tasting cups, their fragrant aromas weaving through the morning air. Journalists from local outlets captured every moment. The smile of an immigrant mother planting her first jalapeno seeds, the nod of approval from a skeptical board member now gardening alongside the former outcasts, and the laughter of children, tracing seed patterns on the pergola's supporting beams. By mid-morning, the stone paths were dotted with small clusters of gardeners gathering around information stations. A master gardener sharing organic pest control tips, a dietitian advising on nutrition, and a youth mentor recruiting volunteers for after-school programs in horticulture. Marisol watched as a former homeless veteran received his seed packets and, with steady hands, tucked them into his jacket pocket, his eyes bright with the promise of growth. As the day warmed, the block party atmosphere intensified. Folk musicians strummed guitars beneath the grapevines, while dancers in colorful skirts twirled among the raised beds. The Retired Carpenters Union unveiled a set of new benches, carved with the names of founding volunteers. Nearby, a banner read, "From exclusion to seed inclusion, Rosewood grows together." Children raced wheelbarrows full of marigold seedlings, and an elderly couple fed grape clusters to visiting friends under the pergola. When the last packet was distributed and the final seed sown, Marisol stood once more beneath the quince tree's canopy, now heavy with early season fruit. She closed her eyes and listened. The hum of conversation, the rustle of leaves, the soft clipping of pruning shears. Every sound wove into a single chord of community, proof that a wound once inflicted by a locked gate had healed into a gathering place for shared abundance. As dusk approached, lanterns strung between the quince and pergola flickered to life, casting golden pools of light on the seedlings newly nestled in soil. Marisol lingered, her gaze sweeping the transformed space. Lush beds, smiling faces, and rows of labeled seedlings waiting to carry the garden's spirit across the city. In that final, luminous moment, she understood that the true harvest was not merely tomatoes or beans, but the unbreakable bonds formed when a community refused to let exclusion define its shared home.